Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Where the next conversation is a really tough one. There are going to be some truly extenuating exceptions, I think. The celiac disease, I know, is an area in which vaccination for other conditions can be problematical. I also know that the claims made by a man called Andrew Wakefield and published in The Lancet have been completely rubbished, and indeed Wakefield himself was struck off for claiming links between the MMR vaccine and autism. I also know that many parents of autistic children still furiously defend him and remain convinced of the link. It's also important to remember, God, this is a tough one, isn't it? It is also important to remember that the nature of science is such that nothing is ever certain. If you read, is it Thomas Kuhn's theory of science, where he introduces the notion of paradigm shifts. So all that science can ever do is offer the best available explanation for observable phenomena, right? So even Einstein's theory of relativity got superseded as more observable phenomena emerged. This is not an area of even close to understanding or knowledge for me. So, I mean, in terms of the theory of relativity. But that's all you've got, you know. So the paradigm is the best available explanation, but no paradigm is ever infallible. Okay, so all of the available science poo-poos the notion of any link between MMR and autism. And that is why you must vaccinate your children, because otherwise you risk the immunity of the whole herd. But I think, and I really do choose my words carefully now, I think that it would be a mistake because of the MMR debacle to overlook the potential link between the gut and mental health. And there are a million reasons. Sorry, I just put my teeth in. There are a million reasons why it's very, very important, I think, to bear that in mind. It also seems to be an area of real growth. A lot of people having their guts tested and finding potential links with everything from depression down or up. You know, I'm not going to tell you who this is from because it was sent to me in confidence, but you know them. So I just mentioned that. Make sure there's no identifying features here. So this correspondent had their microbiome tested, which I think it refers to the gut. 6 weeks later, got my extensive results, and it showed me everything that I'm deficient in. I was given food suggestions to eat, which change weekly to ensure that my gut culture is receiving the types of food that restore balance to my gut. I've been doing this for 10 months. My depression has subsided to such a degree that I no longer feel depressed. It's changed everything for me. I truly believe, with the 30 years of conclusive research that has been done to show the correlation between gut and mental and physical health, is the future of treatment, and even ultimately the prevention of chronic disease and mental health issues. And so do I, actually. Let's not beat about the bush. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's clear to me, for a whole heap of reasons, that there is a strong relationship between physical health, mental health, and particularly the gut. And part of the reason why I've arrived at that conclusion is when you try to work out what's changed. So if you, like me, care deeply about these proliferations of problems among the younger generation that we didn't see ourselves, again, you know, God, it's embarrassing, all these admissions. But I used to be of that, no such thing as ADHD. We just called them naughty in my day. I've been doing this job too long, actually. Eventually, I'm going to do a U-turn on everything. So I used to have that very lazy, red-top tabloid columnist attitude to anything that challenged my preconceptions about the world. So I was very rude about obese people. I was very dismissive of behavioural issues in school, partly because I was a very naughty schoolboy. I used to get beaten a lot. and the idea that that could have been down to some sort of diagnosable condition. I don't know why. It's quite often fat people in this business, quite often the people who are rudest about obesity, or the people who subscribe most strongly to the idea that you're going to encourage people to lose weight by humiliating them and insulting them and embarrassing them. Quite often they're quite fat themselves. I wonder whether my road to Damascus moment came and I lost a bit of weight. I don't know. But in the context of behavioural disorders, what a position of ignorance I used to espouse from behind this very microphone. I just called it naughty in my day. Well, that's clearly nonsense. So all of these areas where you try and find, why have things got worse? Why have things changed? Why even are children today reporting many, many more cases of anxiety or depression than they were when we were young? Has the world changed? Have we changed? Have they changed? Or is it just a case of giving a name to things that were not once considered to be, quotes, conditions, end quotes? And I look at what we eat, and I do think that if you had to track the biggest changes between your generation, my generation, and young people today, diet is huge. This is a very personal perspective that you are absolutely not just welcome, but actively encouraged to attack, all right? You're not allowed to ring me up and say that MMR vaccines cause autism, because that would make you complicit in potential death, all right? Full stop. But the idea that once you open up this door to government insisting that children take vaccinations, I don't know how you close it again. So all 13 routine childhood vaccinations have gone down. Official figures last week showed a fall in the uptake of all 13 routine childhood vaccinations. So this is not just MMR, they've gone down. MMR has gone down for the 5th year in a row. 14% of children not receiving the 2 necessary jabs now. Matt Hancock, who has, I can't remember a cabinet minister who's shed credibility quite as quickly as Matt Hancock has. He says, he said yesterday in Manchester, I think there's a very strong argument for a movement towards compulsory vaccination, and I think the public would back us. Now, we'll talk about the medical side of this, but I want to talk about the social side of it as well, because 12:11 is the time. What would that look like? If I didn't want my children to be vaccinated, and it was compulsory, and that's the word Matt Hancock used. He didn't say they'd have to be homeschooled or they'd be kept out of education. I don't think, again, feel free to clarify. I didn't see the speech. I'm reading reports of it. If I didn't want to have my children vaccinated, would they sort of come around my house and hold them down while they injected them? What would it be? What would it look like for it to be compulsory? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 12 minutes after 12. Parents who did not vaccinate their own children were putting other vulnerable youngsters at risk, he also said. We know that that's true. The worst thing is, if you don't vaccinate your child, then the person you are putting at risk is not only your own child, but it's also the child who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons. So that was what I said earlier. I don't know if celiac disease was the best example to use, but there are conditions which make conventional vaccinations unsuitable, even impossible for some children. We're not talking about them, so don't feel ungrateful, don't feel unappreciated, but don't ring me up and tell me why you couldn't do this anyway for your child, because you are accommodated within the conversation already. In California, making it compulsory simply means that parents who refuse to comply cannot enroll their children at school. Presumably, that is what Matt Hancock is talking about. But if society has made a decision, if the state has made a decision that all children should have this, then you're punishing the child twice by excluding them from school. Right, for good or for ill, you just are. Not only are you denying them the current scientific paradigm with regard to protection from various diseases and conditions, but you're punishing them for having parents who think they know better than science by not letting them go to school and leaving them I'm really, really struggling with this. I bow to nobody in my rejection of anti-vaccine propaganda. Absolutely nobody. I think if you want to understand Brexit and Trump, you start with climate change and anti-vaccine lies, okay? They follow each other like night follows day. But the idea of injecting children or banning them from school if they're unfortunate enough to have silly parents, am I looking at this the right way round? You tell me. 0345 60 60973. How else would we do it? How else would we do it? If you're unlucky enough to have silly parents who ignore science, then you can't go to school. That's like double bubble punishment. I have no personal investment in this, I should stress. I don't have a child who's suffered in any way as a result of not having vaccines or indeed of having vaccines. But I do care about children that I've never met more than I care about parents who have fallen for lies and propaganda on Facebook. And it seems to me that if you prioritise the child with the silly parents or the deluded or the troubled or the vulnerable parents, you're punishing those children twice. I don't do this very often. It's 12:15, and today's final topic essentially hinges around the burblings you've just heard, concluding with this question. Have I got this one right? 0345 6060 973. Just thinking out loud today, all right? And there is no link between MMR and autism. I'm afraid any challenge to that simple statement will not be tolerated or allowed on this programme because it's dangerous. That way madness and potential death lies. But there are questions to be asked about the correct way to ensure that vaccination happens, and banning children from school if they're unlucky enough to have parents who've fallen for this nonsense. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be the way forward, in which case you need, or I need, to come up with the answer to the question of, all right then, mate, what is the way forward? Mike's in Brighton. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
All good, mate.
I'm just walking back from a hospital appointment to get my blood tested.
Okay.
And the reason I'm doing that at the moment is I'm doing chemotherapy because I have a form of leukemia which damages my immune system.
Okay.
And a number of other patients that I've just been hanging out with this morning.
Yes.
And obviously the problem with vaccination, we often talk about toddlers not wanting to catch measles or mumps or rubella. But I have to specifically avoid contact with young people at the moment because there's a potential risk of me becoming infected and I don't have an immune system to fight it while I'm doing chemo. So it's quite an important thing that everybody should get vaccinated, not for their own children, not for those risks, but for the risks of vulnerable people everywhere, really.
Just to understand, I obviously have nothing but sympathy for your situation, and I wish you a full and speedy recovery if that's appropriate. But are you compelled to avoid young children because the avoidance of vaccine has increased?
Humans in general would be a good idea,
right.
But small children, you don't know whether they're vaccinated or not.
That's what I mean. So is there a pertinence to the vaccination question?
Absolutely. It's for the same reason that while I'm taking chemo drugs, I've got to avoid pregnant women because there's a potential that the poison in me can infect people. So, there's a number of issues that I avoid as a person with an immune deficiency issue. But I do think that compulsory vaccination is important.
So how would we do it then? That's the problem, because I kind of think it's important as well, and I feel a bit embarrassed for even quibbling now that you've described your situation so succinctly. But how do we make it compulsory?
I think there's a number of ways that you can apply laws, isn't there? So if you think about speeding, I got caught, unfortunately, speeding on the M23 about 5 miles over the speed limit, and I was offered the chance of either a fine or a day's driver training.
Yes.
Now, a day's driver training was actually quite an insightful thing for me.
I've heard that before. I've heard that from many people.
It taught me to drive better and safer and to respect everybody else on the road. And I think if what we're talking about is parents that have some foolish ideas about what the dangers of vaccinations are, then why don't we offer the opportunity to avoid a fine, but give them the chance to spend some time with scientists and doctors?
But then at the end of that, they still say no. Then they get the fine, and then they still say no.
And if you don't pay the fines, then you end up in jail.
And then you're sending the mum to jail for the child is going to be punished more than the mum.
I think it's a fairly simple process, James. I accept what the medical profession is saying to me.
No, I do as well, but a lot of people don't, and that seems to me to be the problem. And I'm 100% on your side in every...
It's not a choice I'm willing for them to make on my behalf.
No, but that's why the question isn't what do we think about this. The question is how will we actually implement it? And you've just sent someone's mum to prison.
Eventually.
Yeah, I know, but that...
How long does it take to go to prison once she starts breaking speed limits? Or, being a prime minister.
Cheeky.
There's so many ways to avoid it.
I don't know that you've helped me, but that's my fault, not yours, because you're obviously right. And yet the how is often a lot more difficult to properly plot than the what. What do you want to do? Well, this, obviously. How are you going to do it? Well, maybe you're with Mike, and eventually... But even eventually is a problem in this context, because Mike only needs to encounter one infected child with no vaccination, and given his current situation, his immune system shot to pieces, that's it for him. So eventually, I don't even know that there's room for an eventually, and that's his own suggestion, because that builds a window into the time in which he could stumble across that poorly child. 23 minutes after 12 is the time. It's getting worse as well. And again, it is almost as if the world now divides between people who base a lot of their life decisions on rubbish that they've read online and people who are largely unaware of the extent of the rubbish that is now being read online by their friends and neighbours and their children's classmates' parents. Marcus is in Sleaford. Marcus, what do you think?
I'm a parent of an 11-year-old daughter, and we had the very real mental torment battle of deciding whether to go with the MMR.
Well, why was that? Why was that a mental torment?
Because it was obviously it was based on the information that we had at hand at the time, and the information we had at the time. Bearing in mind, 11 years ago, we had there was a lot of controversy about it, wasn't it? From the doctor. I forget his name now.
Well, no, I think it had all been done and dusted by then. And I mean, there is absolutely no link between MMR and autism.
I say, this was only based on the information we had at the time, and we had to play the weighing scales game. And in the end, we elected to have the injections. However, that said, for me, that would have put some of the worry to bay by being able to have them injections separately as well, which I'm surprised was never.
No, but that would have been. Again, sorry if I'm sounding impatient. I appreciate that you're speaking in good faith. That would have been an acknowledgement that there was something wrong with the single-dose vaccine, you see.
But it could have delayed some parents.
No, but then where does it end? Where does it end?
Yeah, I appreciate that.
You go with the science.
We're now approaching later life injections, which he will be having. But there's one injection we're now debating because there is some links to problems. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's called the HPIV.
No, well, let's not do this on the radio, mate. Do you have any medical qualifications at all? I'm not being snide, I promise. I just want to know. But where are you getting this stuff from? Facebook?
No, absolutely, definitely not. It's just more. In the press, there's been some coverage of the injections for girls.
You mean what does it prevent?
It's something to do with the hormones and periods.
No, that's different. My apologies to you. That is something that is currently being questioned, the wisdom of giving all girls and even boys that jab. I'm just off the top of my head, I'm forgetting what it actually immunises you against.
Cool.
But
so, we're having that mental debate now. We're thinking...
Yeah, but there's no suggestion that should be compulsory, you see. So the ones that we're looking at that would... And perhaps you're right to suggest that it could be the beginning of a process, but the 13 routine childhood vaccinations, that's the ones that Hancock is suggesting should be compulsory.
Here's the kicker, though.
Go on.
Here's the kicker. If it proves there is a problem with that particular injection and we suddenly mandate that all parents must vaccinate their kids with X, Y, and Z, and then later on it comes out actually there was a problem with that, then that's a terrible trauma as well, isn't it?
Yes, I suppose so. And one thinks perhaps most obviously of thalidomide at a time like this, or something that was completely cleared, something that was...
I'm I'm definitely not comfortable with compulsory, but I think there should be a bigger push to make these injections more acceptable. So maybe rather than trying to say, yes, we're trying to allay belief that MMR is causing a problem, why not bring into the mainstream a new way of delivering them injections and then sell it as this is a new way of delivering mumps, measles and rubella. Do you know what I mean?
Up to a point. I do disagree with you, because what it does is inflates the idea that there's anything wrong with a single-dose vaccine. And I think it would be a mistake for us to conflate anything that is being considered for compulsoriness with something that isn't. So the HPV vaccine program, HPV is linked to cervical cancer, most obviously. That's why it was offered to girls, but also to oral, throat and anal cancers. Teenage girls have been able to get it in the UK since 2008, but it's of offer to them. And there are... God, it's so tricky, this, when you've got no scientific training whatsoever, but I'm doing this from conversations with friends and family, two of whom are doctors, and the HPV thing is actually in need of further... I hesitate even to say that. I need a doctor, and not for the usual reasons. 27 minutes after 12 is fine. Richard's in St Albans. Richard, what would you like to say?
Yeah, James, we've got a 10-year-old son, and we don't get him vaccinated.
Sorry, I thought I made it clear you weren't allowed on the programme.
Why is that? Well,
because you're endangering every human in the country. I mean, you just heard the man with leukemia. He'll die if he meets your son, potentially.
But this is...
well, it's my fault. I have made it clear to the producers. We do not let people on who don't vaccinate their children because they are dangerous and they are risking the lives of everybody in their orbit. I don't know quite how that happened. I can only apologise to all my listeners. It's coming up to 12:29. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Anti-vax is anti-life, OK? Full stop, in the context of MMR. In the context of some of the other routine childhood vaccinations, I don't have the knowledge. But I do know that the question of making it compulsory suddenly begins to make a hell of a lot more sense when you hear comments like that. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If it's going to be compulsory, here's the question: how would we actually do it? Because a parent unlucky enough to have a dad like the last fella, a child like that is already being punished by having their own health put at risk and, of course, being put in a position where they would be the agent of illness or worse for other members of society. So banning them from school, where they would at least get taught science, or sending mum or dad to prison and leaving the child grieving, effectively. Do you see what I mean? If it's going to be compulsory, how are we going to do it? It's coming up to 12:30. How would you do it? In California, they've responded to very worrying drops in vaccination by banning children who haven't been vaccinated from school. That must be what Matt Hancock means by compulsory, because the alternative is grim, although one caller, admittedly a caller currently battling leukemia or dealing with leukemia, a condition which means he has to avoid any potential infection, which particularly involves children. And humans in general could be dangerous to him, but children in particular, and children who haven't been vaccinated absolutely in particular, could potentially be fatal. And he mooted the possibility of sending these parents to prison, which my initial reaction was to balk against. But what is prison for? If not to prevent people from doing harm in the hope that they will see the error of their ways. Kind of fits. You think of it like that. But I'm still not comfortable with it. What would you do? How would you make it compulsory? 0345 6060 973. We didn't have time last week because blinking politics, but last week's figures from the NHS showed that the proportion of children receiving both MMR jabs has gone down now even further, 87.2% down to 86.4%. The 6-in-1 vaccine, which covers polio, Hep B, tetanus and others, has gone down from 95.1 to 94.2. You know, journalism has a real challenge here, because some very bad people are infiltrating social media, some of them with enormous amounts of money behind them, to seek to influence politics. You can kind of get your head around that, how these bespoke messages that pop up in your Facebook feed claiming that, 7 gazillion Turkish people are going to move into your next-door neighbour's house next week, and that's why you have to vote X, Y or Z. The motivation behind this is rather harder to pin down. I mean, fame and attention, money, in the original misinformation, but now, do you know that anti-vaccine, the last study I looked at into lies and so-called fake news being disseminated out of Russia by troll and bot farms, anti-vaccine propaganda was much more prevalent than anything else. Now, it might have been the timing of the research. I don't know that if they were looking at it during the election campaign in America or during the Brexit campaign here. But if you were simply seeking to destabilise a society and you had no conscience, no morals, no compunction, then I guess something that keeps us healthier and lets us live longer would be something in your sights. I don't know. Now I sound like a conspiracy theorist. But that was a fact. That was a finding of the research into what these Russian dissemination operations, disinformation operations were actually doing. 12:38 is the time. Katie's in Hastings. Katie, what would you like to say?
Hi, good afternoon.
Hello,
firstly.
Katie.
It's the first time I've phoned in. I just wanted to say, because I know you mentioned earlier that potentially banning children from school is punishing that child. Well, I've got a child with a really low immune system there. Both of them are fully vaccinated. They've had to have additional vaccinations so we don't bring extra things into the home and stuff like that. But if an unvaccinated child potentially gives one of them an illness, even though they've been vaccinated, he's already had meningitis, so
Yes.
he could easily get sick again, then my child's being punished for that parent's mistake because he'll then be off school anyway and potentially in hospital. So I'd much prefer a child to have to be at home until, like, in a safe environment than
And that
make
is
my
the
child so sick.
Yes, that is the argument, isn't it? I mean, that's what herd immunity means. And although your children will never be entirely insulated from harm, the protection that is offered to them increases exponentially as the herd immunity goes up. So the more members of the herd are immunised, the more likely it is that, or the less likely it is that your children will encounter these infections.
Exactly. So why should mine have to miss school and be really unwell when another child could miss school and just be vaccinated?
Do you? I mean, I can't remember. Mine have left primary school now. But do you have to declare whether or not they've had the MMR jab at school?
I don't think so. I can't remember filling out a form that said I have or
But
have not.
Do you personally have to check? Do you? Because you mean you must be concerned with making sure they don't get into the orbit of someone who hasn't been vaccinated.
I don't think that's something that they would share with me in the school, whether everyone's been vaccinated.
So you could
or
have
not.
your children at school with that fella who we had to give very short shrift to because he hasn't vaccinated his child, his 10-year-old. Could be in the same class as your kids, essentially endangering their health and even their lives.
Yeah, because he's already had, one of my child has had a collapsed lung, pneumonia and bacterial meningitis B. And he's been fully vaccinated. He's just got such an low immune system that anything can kind of catch and
No, I understand.
go.
So how would we make
things.
it compulsory, though? So you just say you're not allowed in school if you haven't had your jab?
Yeah, so not necessarily like send to prison or anything like that. Just until you've had your jab or you can't come into school. So because there has to not be a punishment, but some
Well, it
kind
is
of
a punishment. We might not like that because some parents will refuse, and you've got to be built in a fairly stubborn way in order to have even ended up in this position in the first place. So when you say to them your child isn't coming to school until they get a jab, they say, right, fine, my child's not going to school then. And that does punish the child, but nowhere near as acutely as your child would be punished if that parental ignorance went unchecked.
Because they would still have to be homeschooled. They wouldn't be able to be uneducated. If that parent decided not to send them to school, they would have to be homeschooled. They just can't get away with not having any form of education. So it just puts the onus back onto the parents that if that's how strongly you feel about some absurd non-vaccination, well, then you have to take it in your life that you have to homeschool and potentially still make like that leukemia caller poorly by coming across them, and it's
that puts it into yes. They've done it in Italy. They've banned unvaccinated children from school in Italy. It's not just in California. Parents risk being fined up to €500 if they send an unvaccinated child to school. Children under 6 can be turned away. And even though it was introduced months ago, the experts in Italy say that the rates have gone up as a result. It shouldn't be problematical, should it? And the only reason why it's problematical is that misinformation has seeped into the national conversation or the international conversation. I guess another argument would be it makes it even more urgent that we get the misinformation out of the international conversation. But you can't hear someone like Katie describe her children's condition, her children's situation, and conclude that they should be put at risk by the anti-science stubbornness of fellow parents. I don't think you can. I'm still struggling with the question of how best to police it, though. Lawrence is in Woodford. Lawrence, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Afternoon. Lovely to talk to you.
Well, we'll see.
Well, we'll see indeed. I think there is precedent for the medical profession forcing a treatment onto a child against the wishes of parents.
Yeah, of course there is, with religious reasons, isn't there?
Yeah, you certainly have, if you're under a certain age and the child is an extremist needing a blood transfusion,
and you're a Jehovah's Witness, then
disagrees, the parent is often overruled if it's an extremist.
Always, I think.
So, and equally, if a mother is pregnant and actively does not want a cesarean, but because of some emergency situation for the health of a child, there could be legal arguments for, again, overruling that for the sake of the child.
But that would involve what? I mean, holding mum and dad in the kitchen while the authorities hold down the children and inject them. I mean, I'm not being deliberately absurd. I'm literally trying to work out how you do that in the context of what you described. The child would already be hospitalised, so it's a simple case of keeping the parents away from the hospital bed, or perhaps preventing them from spiriting their child away, which has happened in other contexts, as we know. But it's the tension between parental responsibility and society, isn't it, in a way?
And you're talking about the logistics of in a community setting.
I am, yes.
But there are situations where social workers, where GPs who are concerned for whatever reason about the health of a child for some safeguarding risk or some health risk, they are, flagged up and they're spoken about at weekly GP meetings, and the social workers and health visitors will be regularly present at mum's house. So you could include, if they are not vaccinating their child, that could be a flag, to get other services involved.
Yes.
And it's untidy, it's messy, it's not great when, for example, a child will need to have a blood transfusion against the parents' wishes, who will be wailing and screaming and so on.
And then you crack on and do it.
It's sometimes you have to crack on and do it. And I think if you're talking about the health of that individual child and the other individuals, like the gentleman with leukemia, or your other parents with children in situations where they need that herd immunity, I think there is that greater good element. And
it's a very good precedent. And I have to somewhat humbly admit, I normally, I think, would have reached for that one myself. I usually do because it's as rare as hen's teeth, but it is potential, and I think it has happened. 12:45 is the time. That clumsy conversation I had earlier with another caller about the HPV vaccine. Don't set any store at all by what I said. Talk to your doctor. I kind of tried to stress that I have no real understanding or knowledge of it. I just noticed someone said that I spoke very wrongly. I didn't mean to. I'm certainly not implying that it's not safe or anything like that. I was simply drawing the distinction between a jab that is compulsory, potentially, and one that is merely offered. There is no suggestion, as far as I'm aware at the moment, that the HPV vaccine should be made compulsory. These are childhood vaccinations, most obviously looking at MMR, but absolutely conscious of the dangers of slipping into the traps that you're describing, as you described them, by dint of not having medical training or scientific training. So it is not part of today's conversation and not something I have any qualification or basis for discouraging you from pursuing. As ever with these sort of issues, talk to your doctor. 12:46 is the time. And, you know, I suppose every time a parent is sent to jail, the child is punished twice, once by having a criminal and once by having an absent parent. So if they were to make these jabs compulsory and parents were to refuse still to do it, then you withdraw the child from the school. But they still run the risk of bumping into people who are at particular risk of infection from unvaccinated children. So then you have that parallel with what happens to Jehovah's Witnesses when their child needs a blood transfusion and their religious beliefs are repelled by the idea. The state intervenes and saves the child's life. Oh, 12:51 is the time. LBC's political editor Theo Usherwood has gone to Manchester so that you don't have to. It would be remiss of us not to take an update before 1 o'clock. Theo, what's occurring?
Well, there are questions today, James, good afternoon, about the Prime Minister, his language and his conduct, specifically about whether he has a women problem. If we're starting with the language, Boris Johnson, of course, faced widespread condemnation last week after he told the House of Commons the best way to remember the murdered Labour MP Jo Cox was to get Brexit done. Jo Cox, of course, campaigned to remain in the European Union. Her widower, Brendan, described the claim as sick. Today, the PM was asked by ITV News whether he regretted the comments.
I remember the day vividly, and it was appalling. And I also think that the threats that MPs face, and particularly female MPs, are appalling. And I lament the death of Jo Cox and regret it very much. And
do you regret that comment, Prime Minister, about the best way to honour her memory is to get Brexit done? That seems strange, doesn't it?
Well, what I mean by that is that if we are to move on as a country and to come together, I do think that we need to get this thing over the line.
So no apology to her family.
I have. I don't want to go into our private conversations, but I have tried to clear it up with her family, and actually, they have been very understanding.
And you'll be meeting them soon.
And I don't want to go into that.
Now, we understand from Jo Cox's sister, Kim Ledbetter, that Boris Johnson's office did contact Brendan, but nobody has contacted either herself or Jo's parents directly. That's the situation as we understand it. There are also questions, James, about Boris Johnson's behaviour. Yesterday, the respected journalist Charlotte Edwards wrote that Boris Johnson had grabbed her in a thigh during a dinner. Number 10 pushed back against that claim, describing it as untrue. That brought a stinging response from Edwards, saying if the Prime Minister doesn't recollect the incident, then clearly I have a better memory than he does. Now it turns out that Mary Wakefield, the wife of Dominic Cummings, was sitting on the other side of the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, at that same dinner. She's said that Boris was a good boss and nothing like this ever happened to me. This morning I asked the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, whether Boris Johnson had questions to answer, whether it came to another allegation that he's facing, his relationship with the American businesswoman and model Jennifer Arcuri.
Prime Minister, I think, has already answered questions on that. He's been very clear that he hasn't done anything wrong. All rules have been kept to at all times. I think it's being looked at by the Mayor's office or something, but that's up to them. But the Prime Minister is very clear on this. And in fact, if you look at his actual track record of being Mayor, it's an excellent record. Look, if as you say, the GLA are looking into this, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to get into something if it's being looked at by them, but the Prime Minister has been very clear on this. There's been no wrongdoing, no rules have been broken. He just couldn't be clear on that.
Sajid Javid is due to speak at 2:30 in the main conference hall today. Dominic Grieve is one of the few number in that 21 who, of course, lost the Conservative Party whip, and he said he hadn't exactly had a pleasant time since he's arrived here in Manchester for the Conservative Party conference.
There are one or two people who have been not personally hostile, but I've heard some chuntering behind my back.
What like?
Well, just sort of, what's he doing here? Why is he here? Surely he's not a member of the party, but I am a member of the party, despite the fact I've lost the whip. And as I had some fringes to do, I came up to do them.
The only other one of that number who is here that I've seen is Rory Stewart, the former International Development Secretary. James.
Why would Sajid Javid refer to Boris Johnson's record as mayor rather than his record of telling the truth about his relationships with women who aren't his wives?
The Chancellor is trying to concentrate...
But no one was questioning his mayoral performance.
No.
They were questioning his moral performance. So
yes.
If you were to examine his record of moral performances, it'd be rather hard to see how Sajid Javid could get out of bed straight.
So Sajid Javid is concentrating on Boris Johnson's term in office as the Mayor of London, and they're trying to make it about whether, as the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson broke any rules, rather than making it about Boris Johnson's moral compass as to whether he had an affair with Jennifer Arcuri, and of course the questions as to whether he had behaved inappropriately at that dinner when he allegedly groped the journalist. Of course, it is worth remembering that an allegation against Michael Fallon, Sir Michael Fallon, the former Defence Secretary, a couple of years ago, cost Sir Michael Fallon his job as the former Defence Secretary. Boris Johnson, of course, though, won't be resigning over this allegation, and he continues in office.
What's the atmosphere like at conference in general?
It's a bit strange because there's what's going on in Westminster, and we're expecting there's still this tug of war in Westminster about whether the opposition to Boris Johnson can get behind a government of national unity. It's being called the lead candidate, of course, is Margaret Beckett, the former Foreign Secretary, but Jeremy Corbyn isn't willing to let that happen, so it's reached something of a stalemate. And then there's a question about whether this afternoon, going into tomorrow, there'd be a vote to potentially give power to the Speaker, John Bercow, to take control, to go back to Brussels and seek an extension to Article 50, and then also around bringing forward the date by which the Prime Minister has to ask for an extension to Article 50 to the 5th of October, this Saturday, because there is a fear amongst those who don't want to see a no-deal Brexit of there not being enough time between the current date, October the 19th, and October the 31st, in which to launch a successful challenge in the Supreme Court. So there's lots going on in Westminster. Everybody's got an eye on that. And then there is also the possibility, James, of Labour bringing forward a motion to change the law so that people can vote at 16, which, of course, Jeremy Corbyn and his aides think would significantly change the result of any forthcoming general election, and that would be a big problem for the government. So at the moment here in Manchester, everybody knows that this is not really where all the substantial action is. And usually when there's a conference where political parties go, everybody follows, and that's where the story is. But really, what's going to make a difference to Brexit, potentially over the next 6 weeks, is all taking place in Westminster, and that for ministers and MPs has an impact because, of course, they can't focus their attention here. And if you're a political geek, if you're a member of a political party, the reason you go to conference is to see your heroes. Dominic Cummings was having a selfie with Tory members the other day as he walked out of the Midland Bar in a hoodie, clutching a bottle of champagne and a bucket of ice. So that's what usually happens. And if the heroes of the Conservative Party, 4 Conservative Party members, aren't here, it's very difficult to build this.
To get that morale boosting, that kind of get the bandwagon rolling. Theo Ushwood live from Manchester, where that Conservative Party conference continues. That's it from me for another day.